Thank you, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, cool. Yeah, so my talk is called In Defense of Boring Technology, as Chen said. I'm Mark. I have the privilege of leading a very talented team of developers and operations people that at Planning Center we call our DevOps team. And as Chen said, that's an actual quote, and I really did say that. So that's like a little window into how I think sometimes. There's also this, and it's hard to see, so I'll explain. But what it is it's a Novell network, Novell NetWare server that had 6,030 days of uptime. So you know, it's such a beautiful sight that it practically drove me to tears. Just like the thought of this little server just sitting there doing its job with no fuss for 6,000 days. It's a beautiful thing. You know, last time I got in trouble because I went like way over on my talk. So I found a way to distill this talk down to its core element, and I'm gonna do much better this time. So if a developer comes to you as an operations person, or if you are the developer / operations person, or if you're just a developer and another developer comes to you and they say, I want to include technology X into production, just take a deep breath, be calm, and just say no. No? All right, end of discussion, all right. So I'm Mark. We have a great slate of speakers tonight, and no, just kidding. It may seem a little weird to plug another talk at the beginning of my talk, but if you have a chance, there's a talk by Dan McKinley on this subject. I saw it at VelocityConf in New York City about 2 years ago. I remember I was sitting next to James, and James is another speaker tonight. I was sitting there next to him, and when he was giving the talk, I grabbed James's arm, and I'm like, he's talking to me. It's like his words were entering my soul, because it articulated some thoughts that I will cover here, but like I didn't have a way of expressing them, and that kind of like led me down that path. So I will be covering some of those points from that talk in a much smaller way, and then some of my own things. So, but anyway, check it out if you get the chance. So what this talk isn't, okay? So this talk isn't condemning the use and selection of new technology or libraries. Like everything for your application involves like a pragmatic evaluation of the pros and cons of what including it will do. And so like every piece has to be approached as such. And so that's my blanket disclosure that, I am not, just hating on all new technology. So what this talk is perhaps a slightly inflammatory, but probably not too bad, attempt to scare you into developing or enhancing I'm gonna call it a healthy skepticism of software and libraries that you include into your applications. So, let's define boring technology. So I got things up there. I've got copy, I got rsync, I've got sendmail, I've got fork, I've got cron. And we can all agree that those are building blocks that anyone would need to build a modern application, right? That's it, and we're done. Just kidding. Like this is just software that like it's boring because it works so well you can consider it infrastructure. You trust it completely. Like you think of it, it's like the traffic lights of the software world. They just work. And so like I consider that boring, but even so, like not really. It's kind of cool. But things like MySQL aren't really boring. But this slide has the things that like if you were coming in thinking like a talk on boring technology might include these things, and that's like MySQL and Postgres and PHP and Ruby, Rails. But these things like aren't boring. They've just reached maturity, and they've reached maturity because the software and its use cases are completely understood. And aside from that, like maybe perhaps like, the people organizing the hip conferences have all like moved on to other languages or other technologies. The number of think pieces on Medium about impending features are way down. But I mean, Rails is still cool. MySQL is like amazing software. I learn new stuff about that like all the time. PHP is PHP. But you can use it to make really cool things, and it's, so in that of itself, it's really cool. So what are we talking about then when we're talking about mature software? We're talking about like those technologies, and the benefits, of mature technology are many, but I'm going to focus on what I consider to be the biggest one, and that is this concept of known problems versus unknown problems. Okay, and so that is a little bit, just like words, but you'll bear with me. Okay, so this concept is something that I've also had in my mind, but I had a tough time expressing, but it was introduced to me in Dan McKinley's talk, where he called it known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Let's move forward with it, but we'll just call it, for the sake of this talk, we'll call it known problems versus unknown problems. So what are they? Well, known problems versus unknown problems is, you can tell by my highly scientific chart, where I made the one that I wanted to not be the good point tall, and the one that I want to be the good point small, that it proves my case entirely that new software is bad. Have we decided that's settled? Okay. No, but really, you can think of it like, so the way I like to think of it is like known problems are like bugs that exist, and unknown problems are like bugs that are just kind of there, like they're waiting to be discovered. Like the software hasn't been given the opportunity to run into them yet, and they're out there waiting to blow up on you. Because production production environments are challenging, and things change inside of them, and when they do, they often surface bugs, and those bugs are the unknown problems. So as an example of like the mature technology with the less of that is, I'm going to use it in this talk, but like MySQL. If you're using MySQL, like, unless you're Google, Facebook, or running, way on the edge of some newish feature, like you are, everything that you could possibly run into with that software is on Stack Overflow, like everything. And if it's not, then it's probably a blog post on the Percona MySQL performance blog, which is amazing. They've spent years, like there's the move from new software to mature software, and it's like they documented it because every time they ran into something, they blogged about it. So let's look at that bar graph another way. So you can think back to that, that highly scientific graph. Like, how do we go from this? So this is in 2009, and I remember I was at this talk, and there was MongoDB is the future, right? So 2009, in the Rails community, MongoDB is the future, and this was like not an uncommon view held at that time. It was wildly popular. So MongoDB is front page of Hacker News like twice a week. It's flying high. Let's fast forward 4 years, and we have like MongoDB, Snapchat of databases. Basically, there's 4 years dividing those two tweets, and like, how do you go from flying high to the butt of Twitter jokes? And all of that is going back to what we saw in that other graph, where the transition of running into those unknown problems. Although, like, it almost feels bad to use Mongo as like a butt of this joke, only because like A, that it happens all the time, but B, like MongoDB in of itself is like not bad software if you're using it for the appropriate use case. And in fact, I always thought that tweet was kind of funny because it was like the Snapchat for databases. When I think like Like losing data is like a core feature of MongoDB. Like the capped collections are like, the whole intention of it is to just lose data after a certain point in time. So anyway. But so in the example, the like the train is unknown problems, and the bus are early users in production, and it's coming through, and you're going to get hit by it. You just don't know how big it is or how many of them there are. So it's going back to this thing. Every app's journey to maturity is different, and the larger the hype involved in an app, like early in its lifespan, I tend to see that's the larger the backlash is when people like run into things in production and are shocked, like, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe that it didn't work. Well, there's a reason for that, and that's the reason. And you can totally use software where it does have a higher level of unknown problems, and you're definitely on that side, but you just have to weigh the risks and make the decision that's appropriate for your application. So let's talk a little bit about constraints. When you decide to put a new piece of technology in your stack, you should feel like you're coming up against a constraint. Like, not all of us have the luxury of green fielding every new feature. And even if you could, I don't know if necessarily, like, to me, the awesome solutions aren't necessarily the ones that are, like, say you need to solve problem X, and you could do it with a new data store, a new background job system, and in a different language. And you could do those three things. And while those three things could be awesome, you're not really facing yourself with any constraint if it's completely different than the rest of your environment. So for me, the awesome thing is always solving problems within the constraint of what you currently have in production, or at least doing your best to try to. And like, if you want to move on to like some other texture, there's some things you should keep in mind. So, let's take a look at some considerations. The first one I'll call reliability considerations. And this has to do with, like, I'm thinking in terms of web applications, but all applications are different. But you are only as available as the lowest availability software in your request chain. And this is something that took me a while to completely understand. So let's unpack it a bit. If we're talking about like MySQL and Super Graph Database X, if you hit MySQL 100% of the time on every request, but you hit Graph Database X like 20% of the time, if Graph Database X fails on you, then is that 20% error going to take down the rest of your site? You have to think about that. Like, now, are you pegging your site's availability not to MySQL, but to Graph Database X? It's just something to keep in mind. That's why, like, if you're doing web stuff, you got to guard things that are in line in the request chain much more stringently than you do anything that's off or outside of the request chain. Let's look at team considerations. You can throw, like, I kind of learned you can throw people at problems kind of like you can throw servers. If you've heard that statement, like, hey, we'll just throw servers at the problem. You can kind of do that if you had a big enough team with people. You can, engineer your way with that team of people out of a lot of these problems. But if your team is small, and a lot of the people that come to these talks and come to Full Stack work on small teams, my advice to you is if it's something that is going to be, touched during a customer facing web request, then be ruthless about how your evaluation. And that's because the larger the surface area, of your application gets, the more potential failures are out there, and the harder the software as a whole is to maintain. So, like, how ruthless should you be? Well, I always like a good measuring stick for myself personally in my meetings is like, You like to think like, you want to walk it up to the point where you're just starting to feel ashamed of yourself for being such a stick in the mud. Like if you're like, oh, I am so lame, then you've just about got it nailed. Like maybe back a little bit, but like you want to be right around there. But that's not to say like sometimes the answer is like use new technology. Like it's time, like we need to use it. So what are the best ways to decide whether it's time to do that? And that is to have clear expectations with developers or yourself if you are the developer, because sometimes you're making these decisions. It's like an internal monologue. So like have this with yourself. Like, you know, some questions to ask are like, what in the current stack makes solving this problem unreasonable or impossible? Is this a new system, or are we migrating away from something that we're already currently running? If we're migrating, what's the migration plan, and how do we do it in steps? Like, how do we limit our risk? You know, what happens if this just completely breaks? You know, be honest with that. Like, what happens if this breaks? Because, you know, that is the most important question. And make sure everyone involved in that process is on the same page. Like, everyone understands, you know, everyone's concerns or interests in that decision. And create the consistent process. Once you've figured that process out, apply it consistently. Because that is the best advice, because that will give you like rigor in how you're doing it. So just be consistent with every evaluation. And here's kind of a spoiler about this, because I've been talking mostly in terms of like almost like data stores. Like this talk is only about data stores, but it applies to libraries as well. You know, we once had we had a piece of software that was probably about a week and a half from going into production, and we kept getting this weird bug. And so I went on to GitHub and like looked at it to see like what if I could find, you know, some advice on how to fix it, or if it was just a problem with the library, or how I could work around it. So I went there and I saw the bug. So and I clicked on it, and then the first response was from the maintainer, and he's like, it's like, oh wow, dude, right on, man. I had no idea that anyone would even be using this. And this was like a core feature of that, a core thing of that feature. And it was like my face looked like an emoji. I was like, you know, and you can be lulled into complacency by high version numbers and really nice readmes. But it's hard, like sometimes if you're just browsing Ruby gems, like you can't always assume that like the person that wrote it considers it production ready. You know, unless it's stated as such, which gets you to, you know, if you do go and use some software, you have to understand, I've been in a couple companies and this has bit us a few times. And that's like, if you are the largest installed user of a technology or a library, like if it is critical to what you do, like you have to own it. You have to be comfortable either rewriting anything that touches that code, or like owning that code, like being the developer of that software. And that's very important to think about as you're like evaluating whether I use this framework or this framework, you know, like who's using it, you know, like is it gonna survive, basically. So, you know, I think like in conclusion, if I were to give a thesis to this, it would be that you should feel the need for like your customer-facing features to be cutting edge, but not necessarily the underlying technology or infrastructure. And I think like, you know your system, you know your application, so nurture a healthy underlying skepticism. Until you know how it fits into your production environment, be skeptical, because like software as in like people, you know, like trust is earned and shouldn't necessarily be given right off the bat. Like you got to trust it. So anyway, thank you. I'm Mark. We have a great slate of speakers, and enjoy the rest of the night.